Hello, everyone. This is Sean from the Soccernostalgia blog. I have the pleasure to interview English football fan Mr. Chris Bayes. This interview is separate from a podcast series. This video interview will serve as a companion piece to a written blog presentation on Liverpool's return to Europe in the 1991-92 season in the UEFA Cup. Mr. Bayes was previously interviewed about Liverpool's 1977 and 1978 Champions Cup victories. Hello, Chris. Welcome back.
Morning, Sean. How are you doing?
Can you paint a picture of status of Liverpool in the English football in the summer of 1991?
At the time, we probably didn't realise this, but Liverpool, I suppose, were coming towards the end of what had been like a near sort of 30-year domination of English football. The season prior to the one that we're going to discuss today, so 1990-91, that had been something of a strange season because we'd had like an incredible start to that campaign. We won, I think, the first eight league games and we were unbeaten in the first 15. But then previous, like sort of to Christmas, they suffered like a thumping, like 3-0 defeat to Arsenal. And that really sort of opened up that season's title race. Looking back, I think at that time, like Kenny Dalglish was obviously suffering from some form of like post-traumatic stress disorder, having like led the club through the aftermath of the Hillsborough disaster. He'd obviously kind of attended, I think, every kind of funeral, like the fans who'd sadly died at Hillsborough. So it took an immense toll on Dalglish, I think. His decision making became a little bit sort of frayed, I think, that season. So that particular game I mentioned against Arsenal, he picked a very, very defensive side and it backfired. There was a famous FA Cup game with Everton in which we drew 4-all, and Dalglish described himself, I think, as being sort of incapable or lacking the courage to make substitutions. So he sensationally resigned after that game. Ronnie Moran took over as caretaker, but the kind of the title defense that particular season, it was undermined by like injuries to like key players in midfield. So Ronnie Whelan and Steve McMahon were out for a while. And there was also some big issues in the defence. So obviously Alan Hansen, we didn't know at the time, but he was going to retire, and he obviously left a big hole. Towards the end of that season, Graham Souness came in as the manager, and he'd obviously been very successful as captain of Liverpool. And he'd obviously then been very successful as manager of Rangers. I think that's sometimes forgotten, the job that he had done at Ibrox. He'd obviously done a really good job there. He knew Liverpool. He obviously, had, as I say, had been one of Liverpool's greatest captains. I think, kind of everybody felt he was the right man to take over. But he probably, I think, in hindsight, started to break that side up a little bit too quickly. And I suppose we'll come on to talk about that in a little bit more detail.
In retrospect, at this point, there really was no indication that Liverpool were going to go through their most barren period.
No, I don't think so, because like I say, although we fell away in 1991, we finished second. And we had seasons like that before. So, Dalglish's second season, 86-87, Liverpool had ended up trophyless. And obviously they then responded by like dipping into the transfer market and sort of redeveloping that particular team. So they brought in Barnes, Beardsley and Houghton. Obviously Aldridge had replaced Rush at that point. So I think it probably felt a little bit like that time, like it was probably time for a little bit of a refresh in terms of some of the playing staff. But I don't think anybody would have envisaged the struggles that lay ahead. Arsenal, I think, were like kind of becoming a good side. They'd won the league twice in 3 years under George Graham. So I think they were probably considered the side who were threatening to supplant Liverpool. Obviously, this is pre kind of like the class of '92 coming through at Manchester United. So whilst things were starting to stir at Old Trafford under Ferguson, I think Arsenal probably would have been seen by most people as kind of the side that were threatening to, supplant Liverpool at the top of the English game at that time.
Getting back to Souness, he was looked upon as the returning hero who is coming back to set things right. So I imagine he must have had the backing of the fans at this point.
Oh yeah, I mean definitely. I mean Graham Souness to like people of say like my dad's generation, he was a phenomenal captain for Liverpool, and he's regarded obviously as one of Liverpool's greatest ever players. He'd done a really good job, as we say, at Rangers, and I think that does get overlooked now. Like Rangers themselves had had something of a barren spell before Souness went in as the manager, player manager initially, and obviously he'd kind of re-established Rangers as Scotland's top side, and he'd put in place kind of the roots of what became, the side under Walter Smith that went on to win, I think, 9 in a row, like league titles. So, you can see why Liverpool went for him, really. But one thing, whilst I was sort of putting my preparation together for this. I was only like a young child at the time, but I can vividly remember on the day that Souness was appointed, Bruce Grobbelaar was interviewed on Radio City, that was like a local radio station in Liverpool. And when he was asked about it, he said he felt that the club should have given the job to Ronnie Moran. So I think that kind of highlights some of the issues Souness was going to face, because obviously he'd been a great player for Liverpool, but he'd played alongside a lot of these players who were probably coming towards the end of, stellar careers, and the game itself was changing. And I think Souness saw that. He'd obviously played in Italy, and he'd seen things in the Italian game that he looked to sort of transplant into Liverpool. But obviously, Liverpool had been very successful with these kind of like tried and trusted methods. And so there was a little bit of a clash there. And I think he clashed with quite a lot of players and staff during his tenure. But definitely at the outset, I think everyone was immensely excited about Graham Souness coming back to Liverpool.
Liverpool were back in Europe for the first time in 6 years since the Heysel tragedy. Was there genuine excitement in the city as a result?
Yeah, there would have been massive excitement because, I mean, like we covered in the previous podcasts that I appeared on with yourself, Liverpool's always had, a very kind of special relationship with Europe and European competition. So everyone would have definitely been excited about the opportunity to be back in Europe. Obviously, we're in the UEFA Cup rather than maybe the Champions Cup, which Liverpool had kind of featured in prior to the Heysel tragedy. But yeah, I think everyone would have been very, very excited about being back in Europe and looking to go deep in that competition.
Let's look at the transfer activity in the off season.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because like you can sort of look back with hindsight, and I think we'll do that during the course of this discussion. I think at the time, I would have been pretty excited about kind of some of the signings we'd made. So, like I say, I was sort of like an emerging football fan at this time, sort of like obsessed with Liverpool and obsessed with football generally. So Mark Wright, he was a big signing that summer, and he'd obviously been outstanding for England in Italia 90. And so I think everyone would have felt that his signing could kind of plug some of the issues we'd had in defence the previous season. Dean Saunders, on paper, I think that was a signing that made a lot of sense because, he'd played alongside Ian Rush successfully for Wales at international level.
And we
Um,
have to
so
mention he was very much sought after at this point.
yeah, yeah, I mean, he kind of, it was a British transfer record, I think, the signing. He was torn between signing for Liverpool and Everton. So it was a big coup to get him and Wright. I think they were both kind of considered, sort of top professionals who'd been at Derby previously. Mark Walters also came in. He'd obviously played for Souness at Rangers and was well regarded as a player, even if his middle name was Everton. So I think that probably didn't endear him to Liverpool fans. But I think in terms of outgoings, what I do remember, again, as I say, I was only young at the time, so I was devastated by the decision to sell Peter Beardsley because he was a big, big favourite of mine as a child. Like, may have even toyed with the idea of supporting Everton when he
Mhm.
moved there. But I think the decision to sell Beardsley was a mistake because he'd been a great player for Liverpool.
Especially
Obviously,
what he did later for Newcastle. Yeah.
yeah, he was still playing as a top player, wasn't he, in the early years of the Premier League up until sort of 96, 97. So I think Liverpool made a mistake letting him go. But it's easy probably to say that with hindsight because if you've brought Saunders in at the expense that we had done, and I suppose we'd brought him in on the premise that he was going to play alongside Rush up front, you can sort of see how Beardsley might have been unsettled because I think the previous season he'd been in and out of the side after making a great start to the season. So he'd probably want to be playing regularly. And if Liverpool couldn't kind of guarantee him that, you can probably see why he wanted to leave. What I do think, I say, looking through kind of like the lens of hindsight, like Beardsley was a better player than Saunders. This sort of became a bit of a feature, I think, under Graham Souness. The players were brought in at great expense, but they weren't as good as the players they were replacing. Another decision that summer that was a little bit strange was the decision to sell Steve Staunton, because obviously he'd broken through in the previous couple of seasons and was fairly versatile, could play like left back, left midfield, fill in across the back line. So I think that was a little bit of a strange decision. And when I was sort of thinking about this question, I think now looking at it through kind of a contemporary lens, like Liverpool's squad was good at the time, but we were probably still a little bit light in certain areas of the pitch. So I think we lacked mobility in central midfield at that time, I think. It probably wasn't realistic in this close season, but a player who later ended up playing for Liverpool, Gary McAllister, I always thought he would have been a great player for us to sign maybe like a decade earlier than we did. But the transfer window was active, shall we say, and like we had spent quite a lot of money. So I think expectation was there ahead of the season.
Other players who departed included Scottish defender Gary Gillespie, who went to Celtic Glasgow.
Yeah.
Also, Scottish striker David Speedy. He'd only been there for like a few months. Yeah.
David Speedy had done quite well when he came in the previous season. He was labelled as a panic by some people, but he had done well. I believe there was pre-existing issues and tensions with him and Souness, and he was moved on. I think again he probably wouldn't have got games once Saunders came in. Gillespie had been a great player for Liverpool, but I think probably that sale represented good business in terms of his age profile. But it did mean, I think, that we were a little bit light at the back. Like we didn't necessarily have an obvious kind of solid pick to play alongside, right? Really. So this is what like I kind of mean. We were a little bit light, I think, despite the activity in the transfer window.
Another one of Dalglish's final signings, James Carter, as the season started, like in October, he left and joined Arsenal. Later, veteran Steve McMahon joined Manchester City in December. Also, another veteran, Gary Ablett, in the new year joined Everton. As far as the players who came on, the young defender, Rob Jones of Crewe, he arrived in October. He would have had most likely had a very good career had it not been for injuries. This was a big surprise. Michael Thomas, the scorer of the goal that clinched the title for Arsenal, he joined Liverpool in December, as did Hungarian Istvan Kozma, who didn't see much action.
Cosma was a player who'd impressed Souness in Scotland. I think he played for Dunfermline. I think that's like the sort of panic buy that Souness's reign gets kind of clouded by. Rob Jones was obviously a very good signing, as you say. His kind of breakthrough was one of the real successes of the campaign. Michael Thomas, yeah, I think the signing of Michael Thomas probably speaks to the point I was making before. We lacked a little bit of mobility in the midfield, and I think Michael Thomas was brought in to try and kind of arrest that. But he went on to have a good career with Liverpool, despite the fact he'd obviously, as you say, scored that goal for Arsenal. So, yeah, I suppose what that shows, the whole kind of picture you've described there, is that there were quite a lot of ins and outs, both before the start of the season and during the course of the season, which maybe sort of shows kind of the fact that things were a little bit unsteady, really, in this part of Souness's reign.
So let's look at the backbone of the team at this point.
I think again, like sort of we've started to talk about this. So like he inherited what had been a great side from Dalglish. I think it still looked pretty solid on paper, but when you kind of begin to delve a little bit deeper, there were some sort of underlying issues, I think, with Liverpool at that time. So, Grobbelaar in goal, he'd obviously been a great player for Liverpool, played alongside Souness, won multiple league titles, European Cup, etc. But he was probably someone who Souness was going to have to think about replacing at some point because he would have been in his kind of mid to late 30s at this point. As I say, Mark Wright was kind of brought in with a lot of fanfare. But if you look at Mark Wright's kind of best performances, certainly for England, it was as a sweeper. And so probably can then later for Liverpool, when Wright really began to excel was under Roy Evans, when he was playing in a back three. So I think that signing, whilst it was a good one, we probably didn't accommodate Wright in the way that we needed to at the time because everyone, I think, by and large played 4-4-2 really. So Liverpool had toyed with playing with the sweeper system under Dalglish. I think Mulby had played a sweeper a few times in their season prior to that. And Souness had sort of experimented with the back three when he first came in, but this particular season they largely played 4-4-2, and I don't think that really suited Mark Wright. In terms of other defenders, we've mentioned Rob Jones, who came in. I remember his first game was away to Manchester United, and he did a really excellent marking job on Ryan Giggs, who was an emerging talent at that time and causing defenders a lot of problems. And Rob Jones kind of came in and nullified him in that game. So that was a particularly good signing. You still had Steve Nicol, and he'd obviously been a great player for us. But like I say, some of the other options in defence at the start of the season, Ablett and Hussein, they both struggled in the previous season. So there were some issues really when you look at like kind of the Liverpool sides of the 80s where you'd had like Gillespie, Hansen and Lawrence, and we didn't have a kind of solid, tried and trusted central defence partnership like that, I don't think. Like I say, Jones had come in, he did very well. The other options of fullback, David Burrows, I think he'd had a couple of seasons under Dalglish, and he'd kind of established himself really as Liverpool's first choice left back, and he did have a good season. And this particular year, he filled in at centre half a few times, I remember. And then you still had Barry Venison around at this point, so there were options there, but like I don't think we had necessarily a commanding first choice central defensive partnership, and that was kind of a problem. In midfield, we had a number of players, so like Ronnie Whelan, McMahon, Houghton and Mulby, they were all kind of top players, won top league titles and what have you, internationals. But I think they were all probably approaching sort of the twilight of their careers. So I think that's why we brought in Michael Thomas midway through the season to try and, provide a bit more mobility. And as you say, McMahon moved on to Manchester City around that time. One thing I suppose to kind of like look at and mention, we did bring through kind of like a plethora of young players during this season. So the likes of Steve Harkness, Don Hutchison, Mike Marsh, McManaman, Redknapp, they all kind of made their debuts this particular season. And Mike Marsh and particularly Steve McManaman had really impactful campaigns. McManaman, this was like his first season. He broke through and he was a really exciting talent, and he'd go on to be, one of Liverpool's top performers for the next decade. So there were good signs, I think, in terms of the young players. And then obviously there was a major issue this season because of John Barnes's unavailability. So when I was looking and doing a bit of preparation, he only played 12 games during this season in the league. So the fact that he was unavailable, that was a big blow really to Souness, because at that time, John Barnes was probably, if not the best, one of the best players in the league. So trying to replace him was very, very difficult. And whilst Mark Walters was a decent winger, he wasn't John Barnes Mark II. Very few players were really. So yeah, that was a big problem. And up front as well, like I say, the dream ticket, the idea of kind of Rush and Saunders replicate the form they showed for Wales, it didn't really happen. Rush was kind of injured quite a lot during the season as well, so they never really kind of hit it off in the way that I think people had anticipated. I think Dean Saunders probably suffered from the fact that he never had that regular strike partner throughout the course of the season. So McManaman, I remember playing up from quite a few times this season. And then I think also like a big issue for Souness throughout the year was like he didn't ever seem to have a settled 11 for much of the season. There was constant injuries, and a lot of chopping and changing, which irked some people, and it was considered not the Liverpool way, really. So, yeah, like I say, on paper, the squad still looked quite strong, but once you sort of scratched beneath the surface, there were problems brewing, I think.
Liverpool would compete in the UEFA Cup, a competition that they had not been in since 1976. What were Liverpool's chances viewed at this point?
Yeah, I think largely we would have been quite optimistic, really, because obviously we'd seen English clubs return to Europe the previous season. So I can remember watching Aston Villa play Inter Milan, and they won handsomely at Villa Park, but then lost, 3-0 in the return leg. Obviously, Manchester United had won the Cup Winners' Cup the previous season. So I think the fact that English clubs returned and United had done well, it kind of gave maybe a false impression that like English clubs would just be able to return to European competition, compete and look to reassert the dominance they'd had in the 80s. But that didn't prove to be the case for reasons we'll sort of explore in a moment. But I think before the campaign, we would have been positive about being back in Europe and positive about our chances.
Was there ever a discussion regarding the new foreign players restrictions in Europe that allowed for foreigners? And as a result, English clubs could no longer regard other British players as non-foreigners.
Yeah, this was a new rule, I remember at the time. And if you think about like Liverpool's dominant period in the 70s and 80s, it hadn't been in place at that time, like you say. Liverpool's side, I think, had always been more British than English. So the European Cup winning sides that we discussed in the previous podcasts had a Scottish spine, and there'd always been a smattering of Irish and Welsh players in Liverpool's squads. So I think this rule change did affect English clubs as a whole, but it was definitely going to affect Liverpool because suddenly you had a situation where Ronnie Whelan, Nicol, Houghton, Rush, Saunders, they're considered foreigners. So that's even before you factor in Grobbelaar, Hussein, Molby, Rosenthal. So it meant, I think, that we were never really able to pick our strongest 11 in Europe at this time. And what it did result in, I think, is Souness playing some of those younger players that I mentioned previously. So I think a number of them made their debuts in Europe, and also like the likes of Nicky Tanner and Mike Hooper, who'd been reserves really and not featured a great deal in previous seasons. They were playing really in the European games because we couldn't necessarily accommodate other members of the squad. So yeah, I think it was kind of noted. And when I watched kind of some of the footage of the games, particularly the game against Genoa that we'll come on to talk about. The pundits are talking about it. So yeah, I think it was kind of a problem that was kind of anticipated.
Where were you in life as this season unfolded?
Yeah, well, I was a young fan, so I would have been about 7 or 8 around this time. So really beginning to take an active interest in Liverpool, going to the matches maybe for the first kind of times. I remember at the time, and it's in one of the match day programs that I've got sort of here that I was reading yesterday. The BBC produced a VHS that I had called Liverpool in Europe. So it was like an hour or 2 hour kind of film about kind of the previous campaigns in Europe. So I think I wore out watching that really during the course of this season. That kind of obviously helped me in terms of learning about our history. And also I would have discussed kind of our participation in Europe with my dad and like friends and family members. And obviously, everyone knew that kind of being in Europe was a big deal. So yeah, that was kind of where I was at really at the time, a little bit of an emerging Liverpool fanatic.
Well, let's get into the European season. For the first round, they faced Finnish side Kusisi Lahti, and it was comfortable enough. On September 18th at Anfield, Liverpool won 6-1. Dean Saunders scored a quadruple, and Ray Houghton scored a double. The Finnish side, Lahti pulled a goal back. Either it's credited to Kyle Lehtinen or it's considered a Nicky Tanner own
On
goal
goal,
in
yeah.
some sources. The return leg was a formality. I think Liverpool just went through the motions. It was on October 2nd at Lahti. They won 1-0.
The memory that I have, obviously everyone was eager to be back in Europe. I can remember there being like a banner unfurled, the cop end said like we're back and everyone was excited. Like you say, it was a little bit of a mismatch really. What I do remember from the game, I remember Kusa had Cop on their shirt as a sponsor,
Yes.
which I thought was quite apt, really. Type of thing you remember as a child, really. But yeah, as you say, it was a fairly straightforward tie, really finished in the first leg. But, getting beat, I suppose, in Finland, yeah, it was academic, as you say, but we'd already lost sort of 2 league games in the early part of the year. So that meant we'd like lost 3 times before, October, which was maybe a little bit of an alarm bells starting to ring kind of situation. But as you say, fairly safely through that one, really.
Now, the second round opponents were the good French side of Auxerre, managed by the legendary manager Giroud. Liverpool had quite a scare in the first leg. On October 23rd at Auxerre, they lost 2-0 when Jean-Marc Ferrari in the 42nd minute and the Hungarian striker Kalman Kovacs in the 60th minute scored for the French side. A 2-0 loss can be a significant advantage in Europe. But on November 6th at Anfield, Liverpool overturned this deficit. They were beneficiary of an early penalty kick that I think set them on the road to win. So in the fourth minute, McManaman was fouled by Stefan Mahe in the box, and Jan Molby scored from the spot. Mike Marsh doubled the lead in the 30th minute. So in the first half, the tie was leveled. We go into the second half, and French defender Frederic Darras was sent off. So that helped Liverpool, who needed to score a third goal. And they did score the third goal through Mark Walters. Liverpool were through to the next round. I imagine overturning a deficit at Anfield must have been a welcome sign at this point.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can remember watching the first leg on television. I also remember Jamie Redknapp making his debut for Liverpool in that game. But we were well beaten in the first leg, as you say. I think, a lot of people were quite dismissive of our chances ahead of the second leg. But as you say, we got the early goal. There wasn't a capacity crowd at Anfield, which, kind of when you look back now, it seems strange, but that was quite common really at the time. But there was a really racist atmosphere at the game. So, it was a great win and a great European night. Malby was outstanding in that particular game. He had a hand in all three. He scored the penalty and kind of basically had a hand in the other two goals. And also, that game was memorable because two of the young players that I've mentioned, like Mike Marsh and Steve McManaman, both had really good games. So it kind of felt a little bit like probably our best performance under Souness at that point, and like we'd turned something of a corner. But as was often the case under Souness, the next crisis was only just around the corner, really. But that particular game, yeah, kind of great performance, great European night, and it was certainly the first time I can remember seeing Anfield under the lights, and it was impressive.
For the third round, Liverpool face Austrian side Tirol Innsbruck. Now, this would be two comfortable matches for Liverpool. The first leg at Austria on November 27th, Liverpool wins 2-0 through a double from Dean Saunders. On the return leg at Anfield on December 11th, in front of a meager crowd of 16,000, Liverpool wins 4-0. Dean Saunders scores a hat trick, and Barry Venison scores a beautiful long range shot. Liverpool are through to the quarterfinals. At this point, Dean Saunders is scoring a lot in Europe, but not really in the league. Was this seen as a worry at this point?
Yeah, I mean, he was showing his quality in Europe far more than the league, and this was slightly worrying. Especially, I think, like I said, like he'd been brought in, we'd kind of beaten off competition from other clubs. It was a big fee. He'd obviously played with Rush at international level, so there was a lot of expectation. He probably wasn't fully living up to that, but he was, as we say, doing well in Europe. And I think, like I mentioned before, I think Saunders suffered from the fact that Rush was in and out of the side with injury, and he didn't necessarily have that established partner throughout the season. I think overall, like again, if you look at it kind of coldly as kind of games to goals in all competitions, it was a relatively successful season, but I think the problem was that, he kind of didn't have the established partner, and he wasn't perhaps living up to kind of the level of the likes of Beardsley, who we'd had, previously. So yeah, there were a few concerns, I think, about Saunders, really.
As the season reached its midpoint, Liverpool were nowhere near in the league as their status demanded, and were having one of their worst seasons. Souness often blamed injuries. What was the view from the fans?
Yeah, I think there was some discontent amongst supporters, really. Like you say, there were kind of mitigating factors. There was injuries, like we talked about before, Barnes being unavailable for the majority of the season was a massive, massive blow, particularly when you look at it like his games to goal ratio in the previous two seasons. Like taking him out of any side was going to be, a blow. I think obviously, as I say, Rush was also struggling with injury throughout the season. Mark Wright got injured and was out to the side after coming in as kind of the big signing to shore up the defence. So yeah, there were like a lot of injuries, and I think while Souness kind of used to point to injuries as a problem, a lot of fans I can remember, like dads and other people who like lived locally, like Souness was seen as kind of like trying all these new methods and kind of changing things. And we'd had a period where we'd had this tried and trusted approach for many years previously, and suddenly we were getting injuries. Now, if you actually look at it again with the benefit of hindsight, injury problems had been a big issue in 1990-91 as well. But I think Souness coming in and kind of trying to shake things up. Some people were saying he was trying to do too much too quickly. The changes to the training methods and stuff were being questioned. There was one point in the season when I watched the season review back, we threatened to make a little bit of an upturn around January time. We got Barnes back in the side, and at one point we went, I think it was like 6 matches unbeaten or something, and we were only 8 points off the top. And United, that's Manchester United and Leeds United, who were the front runners, both had to come to Anfield. So there was maybe a little bit of sort of optimism around that time, but it very quickly sort of dissipated again because, we lost at home to Chelsea and Norwich, I think, in February. So by that point, I think people were starting to ask questions, really. But, like you say, Souness could point to the fact that he'd had a lot of injuries. We were doing well in Europe, and we'd also began a stuttering but thrilling kind of run in the FA Cup as well at this point. So, yeah, I think it was kind of felt probably the injuries were, a mitigating factor.
In the spring quarterfinals round in March 1992, Liverpool were to face Italian side Genoa at the time when the Serie A was the best league in the world.
Yeah.
As fans, what was the general outlook of Liverpool's chances?
Well, as you say, this was the era when Serie A was very much kind of the best league in the world. So I think everyone would have known that facing an Italian side would have been like a definite step up in class and pedigree from what we'd faced previously in the competition. But at the time as well, like, I think everyone kind of would have been broadly optimistic based on Liverpool's previous pedigree in Europe, really. So, kind of the fact that we'd done quite well in this UEFA campaign as well would have given us some optimism. So I don't think people would have gone in thinking it was like a foregone conclusion, but everyone would have been aware that, Genoa would have been probably the strongest side we'd faced in the competition to that point, really.
We come to his matches. First leg is on March 4th at Genoa.
Yeah.
Genoa wins this match 2-0. They take the lead through Valeriano Fiorin in the 39th minute. Liverpool resists until near the end before Branco, the Brazilian defender, unleashes one of his trademark free kicks. They take a 2-0 lead. Obviously, Genoa was a different proposition than Auxerre.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you say there, the tie probably turned on that free kick, really, because I can remember watching this actually at a friend's house, and my dad and our milkman at the time was a massive Liverpool fan, so I always remember talking to him about Liverpool matches. And both he and my dad were like, well, if they keep it to within a goal, that's a good result, and we'll turn it round in the second leg was kind of the common feeling. But obviously then when they'd scored that second, we had a mountain to climb really in the second leg. And I remember the second leg very vividly because my school at the time were like guests. So there was a competition to be involved in this kind of, I think they were performing Italian songs or something. But I obviously didn't go with the school trip. I went to the game, so I didn't kind of. But it's featured in the program, which made me chuckle when I looked back at it. But I would have been focused on us trying to overturn this deficit from the first leg. But as you say, Genoa proved to be a different proposition to Auxerre.
And so this match on March 18th, Carlos Aguilera gives Genoa the lead, and effectively the tie was over at this
Yeah.
point in 27th minute. Liverpool, to their credit, pull a goal back through Ian Rush early in the second half, but then Genoa again through Aguilera scores midway through the second half in the 72nd minute. Genoa were through to the semi-final.
I think you're right. The third goal, in effect, in the tie, the Aguilera first goal on the night, that left us with a real kind of mountain to climb in the second half. We scored early. Rush got one, as you say, nodded home a Barnes cross. And we did make chances, but it's once in a lifetime, isn't it, that you're going to overturn a deficit like that. So, yeah, I think overall, we were beaten by a better team, and everybody kind of knew that, really. The attention then probably turned to the FA Cup.
It was almost unprecedented for Liverpool to lose home
Yeah.
and away. Were there alarm bells that there were bigger problems at hand?
Yeah, I mean, when I say like I watch back the coverage of this, like the highlights, and on the BBC, Barry Davis, the commentator, makes the point that Genoa are only the fourth team to win at Anfield to that point. So it shows kind of the extent really of Genoa's achievement, really, but also, as you say, that maybe things weren't really right at Anfield at that time. So I don't think everyone would have kind of probably been fairly philosophical about this defeat because, as you say, Serie A was probably a level above any other league at that time. And there were probably mitigating factors. So obviously the four foreigner or three foreigner rule had impacted on Souness's selections in Europe. And also, like, he could probably legitimately at this point to injuries being a mitigating factor for the fact we weren't punching at the weight we had done in previous seasons. So I think when I looked back at this, it was probably the following season, really, when alarm bells really began to ring because he'd then had obviously like a full year, another pre-season, and by that point in sort of the 92-93 season, it was evident that a lot of the players who Souness had brought in weren't up to the challenge of playing for Liverpool. So, yeah, I think, probably there was a degree of people being philosophical, but yeah, it did probably point to the fact that the English league wasn't at the level it had been. And obviously, this change in the rules as well impacted English clubs. But yeah, it was difficult one looking back, as I say, because I think Souness, like, he did use the injury kind of card a lot. It was a legitimate factor in the underachievement this season. But as I say, probably the following season was when I personally think, like, oh, well, he's not going to do it really.
Liverpool did go on and win the FA Cup against a second division side, Sunderland. Did this victory somewhat mask the bigger problems that lay ahead that we've kind of been hinting at?
Yes and no, I suppose, is like the way to look at this. So yeah, I mean, we're going to come on in a minute to talk about something Souness did prior to the FA Cup win, which I think represents a key moment in his managerial career at Liverpool. But I think before, kind of at this point, like people would have probably, kind of given him the benefit of the doubt. We had a lot of bad luck with injuries. And watching the BBC coverage of the Genoa game, I think it's Jimmy Hill and Alan Hansen, they're the pundits, and they make the point repeatedly about the injury crisis at Liverpool. So I think, a lot of people were aware of the impact of injuries. And I think did winning the FA Cup did kind of paper over the cracks to a degree because at the time winning the FA Cup, it had a lot of prestige. It was probably seen almost on a par with winning the league championship. So I think it would have gained Souness some credit, but some of that was probably undermined by what we're going to come on to about next. But I think sort of, looking back at this season, if you factor in kind of like it was his first season, we'd had a decent run in Europe, we'd won one of the major trophies, and there'd been a lot of injuries. I think people would have perhaps kind of maybe written off this season to a degree once they'd won the FA Cup. But I think, as you say, it probably did hide the fact that there were bigger struggles ahead.
Now, the controversy you were hinting at was when Graham Souness, he lost a lot of credit with some Liverpool fans when he did an interview with the Sun newspaper. Can you discuss it with those who may not be familiar with this?
Well, it was a catastrophic error of judgment, really, by Souness. And I think one that undermined his relationship with a lot of supporters for many years. So it was basically we'd rescued the FA Cup semi-final against Portsmouth. There was a late equaliser from Ronnie Whelan, and then Souness after this game announced that he was going into hospital for a triple bypass operation. He was having heart problems at the time. So this meant Ronnie Moran was back in charge on a caretaker basis for the return game, the replay with Portsmouth, and Liverpool progressed to the FA Cup final. They won on penalties. And Souness, for some reason, he'd agreed to do an exclusive interview with that newspaper that you mentioned. And that newspaper is kind of basically, verboten banned really in Liverpool because of its coverage of Hillsborough. So in the aftermath of Hillsborough, the newspaper printed a story with the headline "The Truth," and this basically said that Liverpool fans were largely responsible for the death of people at Hillsborough. They'd pickpocketed their own fans, they'd assaulted police officers. There was just ultimately like it was all fabricated at the time. Like there's a bit in Kenny Dalglish's autobiography where the journalist or the editor of that newspaper gets in touch and says, "How can we make this right?" And Dalglish's response was, "Well, you can print a headline like The Truth, but say we lied." And he said, "I can't do that." And Dalglish said, "Well, I can't help you then," and put the phone down. And basically from that point, the relationship between the Sun, you'd note I've tried to not mention the Sun because it does have a very, kind of sort of as I say, it's not very well regarded on Merseyside as a result of what happened. So it was a bit bizarre in the first instance, really, that Souness agreed to do this interview. He would have known kind of the extensive feeling towards that newspaper on Merseyside, and he would have also known the impact the news story kind of had on the Hillsborough families and their sort of quest for the actual truth. So it was naive at best, really, the fact that Souness agreed to do this interview. He claimed at the time and in the immediate aftermath that he wasn't the only person associated with Liverpool who did newspaper articles for that particular paper, but I think he couldn't, probably should have sort of known better than to enter into this. So anyway, going back to what actually happened, he agreed to do this exclusive. Liverpool went through on penalties, and the print run basically it missed the deadline because the fact that the game had gone to penalties. So instead of going in the following day, it went in to the day after the print run for that newspaper, which was on the 15th of April, the third anniversary of Hillsborough. As I say, it was naive at best. It did lose Souness a lot of credibility, and respect with a lot of people. And he himself, I saw an interview that he did with Sky many years ago. He sort of reflects that the decision killed him. And I do think he was genuinely sincere in his apologies, but it definitely damaged his standing with many people at the time.
In general, and you've mentioned this a few times, Souness was criticized for clearing out a lot of the old guard, perhaps a little too soon. He himself later claimed that he didn't go far enough. So who was right?
Well, I think he tried to do too much too quickly, really. And he set about sort of tearing up the squad that he inherited with a zeal that was probably naive and quite extreme, really, in hindsight. And I think also I'd probably question whether he actually cleared out the old guard. So a lot of the players he actually sold still had a lot to offer. So the likes of Ablett, Beardsley, Staunton, we've mentioned, Ablett went on to win the FA Cup with Everton. Beardsley was still performing very, very highly in the mid-90s for Newcastle. And Steve Staunton was one of the best left backs in the Premier League
And in fact, he
for Aston
eventually
Villa.
returned.
Yeah, he eventually did come back, but like he probably, he had his best years at Villa, I think, really. And so I think that was, again, there were those decisions. So you could argue that like the likes of, say, Gillespie, McMahon were probably moved on at the right time. But McMahon had also captained the side in the early part of the season when Mark Wright was injured. So it was a bit strange, as was a lot of Souness's kind of decision making. There's a thing also that I don't know how much you know about this, but like Souness, for some reason, he was responsible for like negotiation of contracts when he was the manager of Liverpool. I think this caused him a lot of issues, really. So when interviewed in years after, he sort of cites examples of like players like Ian Rush being unhappy when the likes of Dean Saunders and Mark Wright came in and they were earning more money than he was. The likes of Ray Houghton, he was actively agitating for a move. And I think Souness kind of admits and on reflection, like he prematurely accepted a bid from Aston Villa simply to get him out of the club. So I think the fact that he was so closely involved with contract negotiations speaks to the fact that Liverpool weren't recognising that the game was changing and they were being potentially left behind a little bit in some regards. I think, in terms of who was right, I don't think either. I mean, I think the squad probably did need refreshing, but I think Souness, the way he went about it, he probably did too much or tried to do too much too quickly. And there was the issue, as I said before, that became an ongoing issue with Souness's managerial reign, that a lot of the time players he was selling were better than the players he was bringing in. And I think it was in the following season it really kind of bore out and started to come to the fore. So, you know, he sold Houghton, Saunders, Venison, fell out with Grobbelaar. He dropped him. Grobbelaar didn't really play much that season. And the signings that he brought in, so David James, Paul Stewart, Torben Peaknick, they all really struggled. There was still the sort of ongoing inconsistency around selection, and suddenly by this point we were in a state of free fall, really, and the road to try and get back to the top of the English game seemed a long way away.
Despite the disappointments, what were the satisfactions in this season?
Yeah, I mean, winning the FA Cup would definitely be a big deal, more so even back then. I can remember that game against Sunderland, and everyone would have been happy that we'd won the FA Cup. I think also we weren't actually actively involved in the league title race, but we had a major say in the destination of the league title. So we played Leeds and Manchester United on successive weekends, I think, at the crucial point of the season. And Liverpool beat Manchester United in the penultimate game of the season, denied them like a first league title in a generation. So that would have been sweet in a way. But I think, these things really, they were papering over the cracks and perhaps giving a false sense of optimism. But I think, winning the FA Cup would have been considered a big deal at the time, and everyone would have been kind of willing to probably write off the season in mitigation. The fact that we'd had so many injuries. I think Souness probably would still have kind of had some credit in the bank at this point, despite what had gone on with the newspaper that I mentioned before.
And also, Rob Jones, McManaman, and Redknapp
Yeah,
were
yeah,
promising players for the future.
yeah. I think that would have been and probably was Souness's kind of like legacy and biggest achievement of his reign, if you can say that. Under his stewardship, as you say, quite a number of good young players came through. So yeah, I think, that would have definitely been a positive.
Was Liverpool's first season back in Europe regarded as just satisfactory, like as a first step to kind of get back to where the team once was?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, I was only a kid at the time, so I would have been very pleased with the fact that we'd won the FA Cup. And I think as a young fan, you obviously have like maybe rose-tinted glasses, but I could see, I think, what Souness was trying to do at this point. So he was bringing through quite a lot of young players, like you say, looking to supplement a squad that had been richly successful. But we've talked about this like throughout that he did make some bad decisions in the transfer market that affected us really. I think if he'd have made quality additions in addition to bringing through those young players, we probably would have been in a much better state, and he might have been ultimately successful with Liverpool then. But I think he was a little bit unfortunate, Souness, in the sense that like he inherited an aging squad, and he obviously wasn't to know what was kind of staring down like the East Lancs Road, with Manchester United beginning to kind of reassemble under Ferguson. And Ferguson, many years later, said, that his biggest achievement was knocking Liverpool right off their perch. He famously said in an interview. And I think that process had already started by the time Ferguson's United kind of began to stir. George Graham's Arsenal were the team who really kind of pierced the aura of invincibility that had existed around Liverpool through much of the 80s. Regardless of everything else, Souness did bring through a lot of good young players at Liverpool, and there was the nucleus of a good side. I think looking back, what I always thought about Souness, he never fully had a clear sense of direction. There wasn't necessarily clarity on a way of playing. I think ultimately the job proved too much for him. I don't think he helped himself. He had a constant ability to fall out with people, both players and other staff. So during the 1992 close season, Phil Thompson, who'd been the reserve team manager, was sacked. I think, again, that was a bad decision, and probably speaks to the fact that he had this inability to get on with people. I think that was a major factor, really, in the fact that ultimately his tenure was unsuccessful.
In closing, for Liverpool historians, how is this first season back in Europe judged? And is that view tainted by the poor league form?
Yeah, I mean, I think in hindsight, it's probably seen as a point where kind of like the balance of power in English football sort of shifts, and obviously Manchester United go on to kind of dominate the next decade or so. In terms of how Liverpool would view this season, it's very much a mixed season, really, because whilst we did win a trophy and had a relatively good European campaign, we were way off the pace in the league, which had kind of not never been the case really in the previous sort of 25 years. But I think it's a bit of an easy kind of generalization that United knocked Liverpool off their perch, because if you look at this particular season, United had they'd lost the league at Anfield, and at this point they'd kind of gone, I think, 25, 26 years without winning the first division. So they had a monkey on their back, so to speak, that Liverpool then had for the next period of time. And I think what this season, if you sort of trying to encapsulate it, it's sort of the beginning of Liverpool trying to kind of recapture something that's gone. Like, kind of, obviously the Souness reign, it didn't work out, kind of the idea of bringing someone in, albeit someone who had links to the club. It was a break with the boot room and with that tradition. I think ultimately, when they parted company with Souness a couple of years later, they tried then to kind of go back to the tried and trusted methods and return to the boot room. So Roy Evans was appointed as the next Liverpool manager. But the 90s, it was a time where football changed immeasurably. I think what this season probably represents is the start of Liverpool in a position struggling to kind of reassert their status at the top of the game against the backdrop of a game that's changing. That's probably how I'd sum it up, really.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. Just to remind everyone to please read the main blog article as well for more detail. The link is included in the video upload description along with our respective contact information. So, Chris, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for the invitation again. It's been a pleasure. And thank you to all the listeners. Cheers.
Thank you.